Hello students, I hope all of you are doing well. This is the last video for module number 2. I was hoping to cover this specific part in one of the live sessions, but since I think I might be caught up on that day, so I'm recording this video now and I'll upload it on YouTube. This is perhaps the sixth video for module number 2 and finally the last one, and this is about magazines. As far as magazines are concerned, I would like to give you a brief overview. Uh, I'm quite sure all of you know what magazines are, and some of you might even are magazines readers yourself. Magazine journalism has been one of the most widely known niches of journalism for years now. But since the last decade, last 10 or 15 years, as social media became very popular, so print media took a hit, and perhaps magazines took the biggest hit out of all other forms of print media, not only Pakistan but all over the world. So right now the situation of magazine journalism, as far as Pakistan is concerned, is not very encouraging that way. But magazines are nonetheless still very important, because it's not just standalone magazines, but even newspapers publish their own magazine editions on a daily basis. And I always encourage students to take interest in magazines, start reading magazines, and even start writing for magazines if you can, because that helps you build your profile as a journalist. So we will be discussing certain parts of magazine journalism, actually very briefly, in this module, and of course definitely later on, as you progress and go on to do your majors in mass comm, you will be exploring more parts. So let me share my screen and get started with magazines. So in this section, we are basically going to cover three things. First, we will discuss what magazines are. Then we will discuss what are the difference between magazines and newspapers. Then we will discuss different types of magazines and what are generic content that you can find in a typical magazine. So these are 3-4 topics that we will be covering in under this section. What really is a magazine? It is basically a publication that is issued at regular intervals. It could be a weekly magazine or a monthly magazine. Even there are bi-monthly magazines, and they basically contains articles, stories, features, interviews, and all different kinds of material. They are very visual in nature, and they also include a lot of advertisements, and generally they have a page size which is smaller than a newspaper, but it would be probably larger than that of a book. That is not always true, to be honest, because I told you might find some magazines which would be at least of the same length as that of a newspaper, or which might be as small as a book. So there are all kinds of varieties available that way. Then newspapers also publish magazine editions on a weekly basis. This is something which I told you before as well. So all the magazines, all the newspapers that we have all over the world, they do have their magazine editions, because sometimes just hardcore journalism is not enough, and there are a lot of topics which cannot be talked about on a daily basis in a typical newspaper setting, because what you are talking about is essentially politics and issues which are happening in a timely manner. But what if you want to talk about history? What if you want to talk about certain issues within the society? What if you want to talk about certain aspects of personality development? What if you want to talk about lifestyle? What if you want to talk about celebrities, or to an in-depth analysis of their personalities through their personality interviews and things like this? So for all these things, magazines come in handy. So they provide you something more than your daily dose of journalism. Magazines have a variety of content such as articles, features, book reviews, movie reviews, interviews, and coverage of different events, advertisements, pictures, etc. Generally, they have a very colorful and interesting display that attracts the attention of the reader, and they have a lot of photographs, and the paper quality is always going to be a lot better as compared to that of newspapers. So you can go to any bookstore and you will find a stand over there in which they have all these fancy magazines, and they are generally quite expensive that way as well, because newspapers are not that expensive, but magazines are. The reason is that the quality of the paper is quite good. Quality of printing is quite good, and they are for keepsake. Magazine articles are long and more in depth. So now here, what we are talking about is the kind of the content that you will find in the magazine. So that is going to be a more in-depth content than that of the newspaper. And magazine journalism allows for a more creative writing style. Since we have not discussed writing of for print as yet, but those of you who read news, you will get an idea that in newspapers, there's specific kind of writing style that is followed for news stories. Of course, editorials or the opinion page have a different kind of writing style that depends on the columnist that you are reading. But apart from that, the entire newspaper would have a similar kind of a writing style. But what if we want to read writing which is more like creative in nature, which is more narrative in nature, and which might not be bound by those five Ws, etc. So those are the kind of content that you will find in a magazine. Most magazines have surprisingly small staffs. This is because most of the writing of the magazine is through freelance writers. And this is the reason why I have told you at the beginning that I always encourage my students to, write for different magazines if you get the opportunity to, because they don't really want you to be in their office from 9 to 5, and they like to recruit staff who can write on a freelance basis. They don't have a huge setup that way. Magazines are much less stable financially than newspapers. They have to appeal to an audience that is much more narrowly defined than that of a newspaper. Now, the kind of an audience that magazines have is actually even narrower than the newspaper audience. We already know that in as far as newspapers are concerned, people who might not know how to read and write, they don't buy newspapers. They get their news through electronic media and other sources. But when it comes to magazines, even some of the people who read newspapers, they might even not be interested in magazines because that is a niche audience. And by its very nature, magazines are made for niche audience. And there are a lot of magazines which just follow different niches. Like there would be a magazine which would only be about household or just about food and things like this. So we are going to discuss that later in detail. But all of these factors basically make magazines audience a bit narrower than that of a newspaper audience in general. Let us now look at some of the differences between newspapers and magazines. The first difference is between the size and appearance of magazines versus newspapers. So generally, newspapers have this broadsheet style. So if you have seen a print version of a newspaper, so that style is called broadsheet. While magazines have more like a book style. So they are relatively smaller than that of the newspaper. Not always, but most of the magazines are. Also, magazines have highest quality paper and aim to produce a visually appealing product because magazines are going to have a more longevity than a newspaper. They make sure that they use good quality paper, and they are going to use more better ink that way to make sure that magazine looks good. The next difference is obviously in the content of both these publications. Newspapers have stories of yesterday. It has first-hand fresh news, what happened, the top stories of yesterday, it is going to present that. But in a magazine, you are going to get content which is more specialized and which is more in-depth. It's not that there might not be any news in a magazine. Of course, the content, specifically if it's a political or a current affairs based magazine, it is going to tell you about what has happened, but then it is either going to be published on a weekly basis or on a monthly basis. So definitely the news is not going to be very first hand. The content that you are going to consume in a magazine is perhaps that you have already read about in a newspaper, but this is going to be content which is more in-depth. By in-depth we mean that it is going to give you more analysis of the situation than that of the newspaper, because in newspaper we don't get time for things, right? So if say there is a flood in the country, Right now there is flood situation in Sawat and in different parts of the country. So what newspaper is going to tell us about that on a daily manner, that what really is happening on that front, किन किन इलाकों में सैलाब आया हुआ है, वहाँ पे कौन कौन सी relief efforts की जा रही हैं, and how the government is coping up with the entire thing, the provincial government as well as the federal government. And that is something that it is going to tell us on a daily basis. So हम लोगों को पता चल रहा है उसके बारे में, खबर के बारे में daily basis पे. We already know that. But after a month and even maybe perhaps even this entire situation gets better और floods खत्म हो जाए, relief efforts भी खत्म हो जाए, तो आज से 2 महीने बाद भी कोई magazine इसके बारे में एक in-depth analysis लिख सकता है, जिसमें वो उसका एक ओवरव्यू दे और कुछ लोगों के इंटरव्यूज भी करें. People who might have lost their homes because of the floods, they can tell us about their plight and how the government helped us. So the story could have human factor as well, and the analysis is going to be more in depth. Even now, after so many years, we read certain articles or certain features about the 2005 earthquake, and काफी अर्सा उस बात को गुजर चुका है. Somehow the newspapers में उस बारे में मजीद कोई stories नहीं आ सकती, other than the fact कि हर साल उसकी जब anniversary आती है, so they just tell us about that. But other than that, of course, magazines में उसके बारे में features छप सकते हैं, उसके बारे में articles आते हैं, अक्सर किसी न किसी affectee का interview भी आ सकता है, or maybe the people who were involved in the relief efforts, they can talk about it. So somehow that the content is going to be very specialized. It could be more in depth as compared to newspapers, because frankly newspapers are on a deadline, so they cannot really go in depth for everything. Then the third thing is style. Of course, when it comes to the style of the writing, even that is different. In newspapers, we get objective writing. I have already talked about it, that there are these 5 W's that they are going to answer: who, what, when, why, and where. So they are just going to tell these five four factors about the news, about the event that has happened, and as objectively as the newspaper can, until unless it's the editorial page. And as compared to that, magazines are more subjective, because every person who's writing for the magazine, he or she is bringing something new to it. They are bringing their own style, their own writing style to it. It could be subjective. So magazine writers are not really bound by that news format as such. तो न्यूज स्ट्रक्चर जो है वो फॉलो उसमें नहीं होता है, बल्कि ज़्यादा क्रिएटिव राइटिंग जो है वो फॉलो होती है. And instead of matter of the fact style, you will see colorful and varied content. So even if you will just open any specific news story versus an article, a magazine article, it could be a feature or a simple article, the kind of style that they have presented, you can simply find out that, okay, this is more interesting. They would use drop cap, they would use these blurbs, they would use these little boxes within a magazine, which would make it more interesting. Just to give you an example, I have this magazine in front of me. You can see it, right? So this is Herald, which was the top magazine in Pakistan. It was being published by the Dawn Group, and unfortunately it ceased to publish from last year. I guess in June or July they had their last issue. Yes, so July 2019, from July 2019 they stopped publication due to various social reasons, they said. And that's why I told you that the situation of magazine journalism in Pakistan is currently not very good that way. But if you can just see some of the pages in this magazine, you will find out that how they present things. Like this is one of the articles, is about cricket and the situation of Pakistani cricket right now, and they have placed this very interesting picture of Sarfaraz, which basically spreads over both the pages. This is something which you can't find in a newspaper, because they want to attract your attention. They are going to use pictures, they are going to use a lot of different things. Or say if you want to tell somebody about a history of things, then there is this one. So this was their last publication. They included a lot of timelines in their last edition. You can see this is a timeline. In a typical newspaper setting, it would be difficult to have this kind of a timeline. right? So this was timeline about the freedom of press and freedom of expression in Pakistan. And there are a lot of different things that magazines include, and they are very colorful and interesting. The style is going to be different in all the magazines. Then another thing which is again different between both newspapers and magazines are the audiences. So the readers are going to be different. Newspapers are targeted at general audience, but the magazines are targeted at specialized audience. So these are the people that would like to read about certain things. Of course, we know that when it comes to demographics of people, some magazines would be targeted only towards women. Some magazines would be targeted only towards sports enthusiasts. Some magazines would be targeted only towards food lovers. There are some magazines which are about car lovers, and there are magazines which are about pets and wildlife, and all kinds of magazines we have. So target audiences always differ. Of course, newspapers can't do that. They have to present the news of the day, so they are going to target on the general audience. The design and layout is also very different. Newspapers follow a simple layout, which I have already talked about, that they are divided into columns. And if Dawn is published on 8 columns, it is going to publish on 8 columns every day. And if they have to publish national news on page number 2, they would publish it on page number 2 for years, until they would make a total overhaul change in their layout. Otherwise, every publication, as far as newspapers are concerned, they are going to follow the same layout every day, and it is going to be mostly black and white. Now there are newspapers who have started printing a lot of color pictures, but उसके बावजूद भी mostly it is black and white. But these magazines, they are going to be visually appealing. There is no consistent layout in magazines. You might see magazines on certain days where they would have some kind of a on the cover is basically the part of the magazine, like the front of the magazine. So they would have something interesting on the cover. They always have pictures on the cover instead of any kind of a text. They just write the headlines about the cover story, which is the main story of the magazine for a day, and they use different interesting pictures, or sometimes caricatures, sometimes even some kind of a 3D object to lure the audiences. Again, I'm not sure if you can see this well enough or not. So this is a magazine called Aurora. This again is by Dawn Group. I'm not very sure about it, if it is still in publication or not, but this is the magazine which is targeted towards advertising professionals or communication professionals like me. So Aurora is a very interesting magazine, and you can see it's very colorful. It's like its cover is quite interesting, and they have this little cute feature as well. So what they have done here, that they have written about all the important stories on this part, and then if you open it, then you can see the entire cover. This is about the entertainment industry, the specific issue, and you can see how they have done that. And before that, I have shown you Herald. So this was the last edition of Herald ever, and they basically printed this picture, which is of course not a real picture. So this is like a caricature that Ziaul Haq is reading Herald, and it's like he's reading it Herald, और उसके अंदर भी आपको मुसलसल वही चीज नजर आ रही है. It's like Inception of some sort. So they are very interesting. The covers are going to be very interesting, and we also know about all the celebrity magazines, that how much people value that who will be on the cover of that specific celebrity magazine. So design and layout matters a lot when it comes to magazines. The next thing is advertisement. I'm not sure if it is something which I really like or not, but magazines are quite advertiser friendly than that of newspapers. So they are more advertiser driven than, of course, newspapers. Newspapers are slightly different in this regard, but this word slightly, please take it seriously, because nowadays even our newspapers are no less when it comes to publishing advertising because they are earning from advertising, and if it is up to them, they can kill the news, but they cannot kill the advertisement as such. But generally, magazines are more advertising friendly. So say if this is a magazine, they would have a lot of advertising all over. So of course, at times even on front page, they they can have an advertisement, but that happens quite rarely. On the back pages, they always have advertisements. You can see advertising here. So entire page is dedicated to advertising, and that happens a lot in magazines. They are most advertising friendly than newspapers. Shelf life. Now, this is something quite important. Shelf life of a magazine is always going to be much more than that of a newspaper. So newspapers are read only once and then they are discarded. In contrast, magazines are commonly kept for several days, weeks, or even months. There are certain people who even like to collect magazines. They have this hobby of collecting magazines. I had this hobby when I was a student, and I used to, collect a specific magazine which was related to the topic was related to my thesis. So I used to collect it every month. So that happens with magazines. Also, at times, magazines are, proudly placed on the study room of certain houses or in the drawing rooms. So magazines shelf life are always going to be more than that of a newspaper. न्यूज़पेपर एक दिन आपने पढ़ा है तो अगले दिन वो आपको शायद कैफे में उसके अंदर समोसा रख के बेच रहे होते हैं. We all have seen that, but that doesn't happen with magazines. Now this is another debate कि अब magazine इतने ज़्यादा लोग पढ़ते नहीं हैं, तो अभी क्या situation होगी in terms of people collecting magazines for certain stuff, but otherwise जो है magazines की shelf life ज़्यादा ही होती है as compared to that of a newspaper. These are certain differences between newspaper and a magazine, starting from their paper quality till their layout, kind of content they have, advertising, target audience, as well as shelf life. And these are very visible differences. If you read magazines and newspapers both, you will realize it that somehow other magazines are more niche and magazines are more target focused, and they contain creative writing and a variety of types of writing for that matter as compared to newspaper. Now we are moving to the next topic within the section, which is the types of magazine. So there are many types of magazines that you will find all over the world, but the biggest differences or the biggest type that you must remember is basically general interest magazines versus special interest magazines. So general interest magazines are the ones that are also called mixed plate magazine at times. Mixed plate means like it's a plate mix of everything. So they would contain a bit of everything for the readers. So they would have stories, news stories, political stories, features, articles, interviews, perhaps a movie review, कोई रेसिपी भी डाल देंगे बीच में और कोई फैशन शूट भी आ जाएगा बीच में, and all of those things combined. So those are called general interest magazines. So there would be a bit for everything to read. Then there are special interest magazines. Now special interest magazines are the ones which are defined, which have a predefined audience. For example, there would be magazines which would be targeted only towards kids or children. So बच्चों ही की पसंद के magazines होंगे, जैसे निकलोडियन वालों का अपना magazine होता है, या अगर हम लोग पाकिस्तान की बात करें, so in our times we used to have these magazines called तालीम तरबियत and Fool, जो कि बच्चों के magazines होते थे. And there are some literary magazines जिसमें जो है सिर्फ literature और writing और prose और poetry से related जो है वो बातें होती है. Then there are some lifestyle magazines. There are some magazines which are targeted only towards celebrities and showbiz personality or entertainment or movies. There are some sports-based magazines. Maybe you might have heard about Sports Illustrated. That's a very famous magazine. International one. Then we have some magazines जो कि सिर्फ political होते हैं, like Newsweek हो गया, right? So these are all the different kinds of magazines that are called special interest magazines. So there are going to be two classes: general interest magazine, so that is just one class, and then special interest magazine, जिसमें फिर further different classes होंगी. They could include literary magazines, religious magazines, political, current affairs, showbiz, entertainment and gossip magazines, sports magazines, tech magazines, fashion magazines, women's magazines, children's, lifestyle, then photo magazines, something which would include only photographs, photography lovers के लिए. Digests होते हैं जिसमें what they are called like अफसाने और इस तरह की चीजें जो है वो publish होती हैं. अभी भी आते हैं उर्दू डाइजेस्ट और इस तरह के डिफरेंट डाइजेस्ट और लोग पढ़ते भी हैं. इन हाउस जर्नल्स होते हैं, न्यूज लेटर्स होते हैं. नॉट दे आर नॉट एग्जैक्टली मैगजीन्स, बट यू शुड नो दैट अपार्ट फ्रॉम दीज specific magazines, there are some newsletters and in-house journals as well, जो कि आपको मुख्तलिफ organization जो हैं वो at times publish करती हैं, and they are used for the sake of their public relations. उनकी ऑडियंस के साथ उनको कनेक्ट करने के लिए वो बनाए जाते हैं. So newsletters are similar as the ones that you get on emails. अक्सर emails पे हम newsletters सब्सक्राइब करते हैं, ऐसे ही न्यूज़लेटर्स प्रिंट फॉर्म में भी आते हैं. तो वो भी मैगजीन्स का ही एक सब टाइप उसको हम कह सकते हैं. रिसर्च जर्नल्स होते हैं, so they are also kind of magazines, but they are only focused on to publish researches about certain disciplines. Then of course we have online magazines and e-zines. I'm quite sure all of you know about that. So these are the ones that you can find on the internet. They are not really published on print, but you can find them on internet, and they are interactive and works just like a website. Now the content of magazine. Magazine में generally आपको किस किस्म का content मिलेगा? There is no hard and fast rule though, but the content that I'm sharing is for a general interest magazine, not really a special interest magazine, because special interest magazine में of course उसी specific topics से related चीजें होती हैं. But again, this could apply to that as well. Editors note या editorial हर magazine में होता है. Editorial, I hope by now you know कि किसी भी newspaper की अपनी policy को हम कहते थे कि वो किसी issue के बारे में अपनी policy बताते हैं through a short piece of writing which would be called the editorial. So उस same चीज को जब हम लोग news magazines के लिंगों में बात करें तो हम उसको कहते हैं editors note. Then the next thing that you will find in every magazine is cover story. Now cover story is quite similar to the lead story which I told you while discussing newspapers. What I told you is that newspapers में जो most important story of the day है, that will be called the lead story. In magazine, the terminology that is used for that is cover story. The most important story for a specific edition of a magazine would be called cover story, and that cover story is something जिससे रिलेटेड पिक्चर या जिससे रिलेटेड हिंट जो है वो आपको कवर ऑफ द मैगजीन पे भी दिखती है. लाइक ये हेलर्ड मैंने आपको दिखाया था, ठीक है, एंड हेलर्ड जो है वो उसकी कवर पे उन्होंने जनरल ज़ियाउल हक की पिक्चर बनाई हुई थी. दिस वाज द लास्ट एडिशन एवर. सो एंड दे वर अपार्ट फ्रॉम फाइनेंशियल क्रंच, दिस magazine was facing some kind of a censorship, so to say, and since General Ziaul Haq represents censorship in the history of Pakistan, because उनके ज़माने में काफी ज़्यादा प्रेस पे censorship लगी थी, so they deemed it necessary कि वो तस्वीर यूज करें. So they put that, and this is their cover, and if you will check their cover story, now this is again cover story, and you might see here that they have put picture of that similar picture again, and this is going to be the most highlighted story of this magazine. Where do they place it? That doesn't really matter. Like they have placed it almost at the center spread of the magazine. Center spread or center fold, these are two terminologies which are used for the middle part of either a newspaper or a magazine. Since this was their last edition ever, so they put this story on the center fold. But ये जरूरी नहीं है कि हर दफा center fold पे ही cover story आए. अक्सर initial pages पे भी cover story जो है वो publish कर दी जाती है. Articles and essays. So when we talked about creative writing, so most of the creative writing that you can find in a magazine would be through articles or different kind of essays. These could be personal essays, these could be just an analytical kind of an article, and this could be anything, you know. So there is no hard and fast rule. There could be articles जिसके बीच में सब headings भी लगाई हुई होंगी, boxes में भी different किस्म का content दिया होगा. There might be some kind of a personal essay, कोई travelogue भी लिख सकता है, you know, वो भी पब्लिश हो जाता है मैगजीन्स में, या किसी और चीज से रिलेटेड जो है वो कोई नरेशन बताएगा अपनी लाइफ के किसी इंसिडेंट से रिलेटेड, सो वो भी आ सकती है. सो कुड बी एनी काइंड ऑफ एसेस, could be any kind of an articles. You will find them on magazines. Then features. Now feature stories are different than normal articles and even the news stories, because feature stories are supposed to be more in-depth stories, and they are usually about topics that are generally not covered in the news. I mean, might be but not always. These could be stories जो कि जिसकी वजह कोई न्यूज स्टोरीज बन सकती है, बट इसको इतनी डिटेल में और इन डेप्थ एनालिसिस से बताया जाता है और किसी भी इशू की हर साइड दिखाई जाती है. सो फीचर स्टोरीज आर द वन जिसने 360 डिग्री एंगल से किसी भी इशू को कवर करना है. फॉर एग्जांपल एक न्यूज स्टोरी है अभी आजकल हाल फिलहाल में भी आई है, दैट a child has been raped, और इस तरह की बड़ी ज्यादा स्टोरीज अभी हमारे यहाँ रिसेंट टाइम्स में आई भी है. If a magazine would publish a feature story on that, so feature story basically होगी about चाइल्ड सेक्सुअल अब्यूज के बारे में, और उस इंसिडेंट को बेस बना के या अदरवाइज ओवरऑल जो है जितने भी चाइल्ड सेक्सुअल अब्यूज के इंसिडेंट्स हुए हैं पाकिस्तान में उनका भी जिक्र किया जाएगा. हो सकता है किसी साइकोलॉजिस्ट से भी उस बारे में बात की जा सके कि इतना ज्यादा इंसिडेंट्स तरह के क्यों हो रहे हैं, लॉ इन्फोर्समेंट एजेंसीज में से किसी बंदे से बात की जाए और कुछ विक्टिम से भी बात की जाए, तो थोड़ा सा उनकी पर्सनल जो ट्रेजेडी है उसको भी फोकस किया जाए, उसकी सॉल्यूशंस भी दी जाएंगी. So a lot of things. So वो एक पूरी wholesome picture आपको मिलती है features में, and that is what makes features different than that of essays or articles. Generally articles में शायद किसी का इंटरव्यू इंक्लूड नहीं किया जाता, but features में जो है वो लोगों से बात करके उनके इंटरव्यूज विद इन द राइटिंग इंक्लूड किए जाते हैं. वो इंटरव्यू फॉर्मेट में नहीं होते कि ये क्वेश्चन पूछा उसने ये आंसर दिया, but they are included in the overall narrative of the features. So features are quite important, or features are something that really enhance the overall experience of reading a magazine. Then there are columns, just like newspapers. People also write columns for magazines, and there are certain famous people जो कि magazines के लिए भी columns लिखते रहे हैं. मैंने I think शायद नदीम फारूक फराचा का जिक्र किया था लास्ट किसी वीडियो में. So he used to write for or perhaps he still writes for different magazines. You know, there could be one celebrity जो किसी ना किसी magazine के लिए कभी कोई guest column लिखते हैं and all. So magazines में भी columns होते हैं just like newspapers. Other than that, reviews included होते हैं, and these could be all kinds of reviews. There might be a book review, there might be a movie review, there might be a review of a newest food chain जो कि city में open हुई भी हो. There might be a review of a theatre play जो कि लगा हुआ हॉल हमरा में, and you know people are watching it and all. So reviews हो सकते हैं किसी भी तरह के. फोटो फीचर्स होते हैं या फोटो एसेज भी कहा जाता है. सो दीज आर जनरली वैसे भी अदरवाइज बहुत ज्यादा फोटोज होती है मैगजीन्स में, बट फोटो एसेज या फोटो फीचर्स उन एसेज को कहा जाता है जिसमें पिक्चर्स के थ्रू जो है वो कहानी बताई जाती है. सो देयर माइट बी अ लॉट ऑफ पिक्चर्स विद सर्टेन कैप्शंस, और उसके थ्रू जो है वो बात को अच्छी तरह से एनहांस किया जाता है. यूजुअली हाउस टूर्स के फीचर्स इस तरह के होते हैं कि किसी सेलिब्रिटी के घर ले जाके उसके हाउस टूर करवाएंगे. ये वैसे उन जमानों की बात है जब ये सोशल मीडिया और वीडियोस इतनी नहीं आनी शुरू हुई थी, बट नॉनदलेस फोटो फीचर्स बहुत ज्यादा पब्लिश होते हैं. अगर आप नेट जियो पढ़ो, नेट जियो का एक मैगजीन आता है which is like quite interesting, and you will find its e-version on the internet. So you should read it because they publish a lot of photo features. They are covering wildlife and different stuff like that. So बड़े interesting उनके photo features. Of course, interviews is something जो कि न्यूज़पेपर्स में अगर पब्लिश होते हैं तो मैगजीन एडिशन में पब्लिश होते हैं, अदरवाइज न्यूज़पेपर में इंटरव्यूज का काम नहीं होता है. सो किसी पॉलिटिशियन का या किसी एक्टर का या किसी स्पोर्ट्स पर्सन का इंटरव्यू जाहिर है ऑफ कोर्स रीडर्स को पढ़ने का बड़ा इंटरेस्ट होता है. सो फॉर फैंस इंटरव्यूज आर समथिंग दैट यू कैन फाइंड ओनली इन मैगजीन्स, एंड परहैप्स इंटरव्यूज की वजह से भी मैगजीन्स को हमेशा बहुत ज्यादा प्रेफर किया जाता रहा है पास्ट में. And finally, advertisement. I think this is perhaps the third time we are talking about advertising in magazines. But advertisements आपको काफी ज़्यादा तादाद में magazines में मिलते हैं because of course their entire revenue depends on the kind of advertising that they get. So advertisements is one of the content that you are going to find in magazines. So this is pretty much all the types of content that you will find in a specific magazine. But let me remind you again that this is for general interest magazines mostly. जो special interest magazines है हो सकता है उसमें इसके अलावा भी कुछ और हो, right? So if it's a magazine which are targeted towards car lovers, so उसमें हो सकता है कि कोई और भी ऐसे features हों जो कि इन magazines में नहीं होते, या उसमें कुछ ऐसा इंक्लूड ना हो जो मैंने यहाँ पे लिखा हुआ है. that might not have any feature, that might not have any column, ये possibility है. So that really depends. Somehow the liberty ज़्यादा होती है magazines में, और जो magazine owners होते हैं they also keep on changing their overall editorial policy from time to time, keeping in mind कि overall audience जो है वो क्या देखना चाह रही है किसी एक specific ज़माने में. Also, let me show you some of the magazine editions that our newspapers have. These are essentially those editions that are published once in a week, and they look just like the newspaper, but they are called magazine editions because they contain features and articles and interviews and things like this. So let me just share a few good ones. The first one that I'm sharing is the news. On every Sunday, the news publish a lot of magazine editions. So if you open the news of any Sunday, you would find 4, 5, or maybe more than that magazine editions on the news. And even over here, you can see that they have pages and they have another tab which is magazine. So if you select the magazine, if you select the newspaper of any Sunday on the news website, so you will find out that they have all these different magazine editions. Every Sunday includes sports one, political economy. In this one, they mainly talk about politics, current affairs, and things like this. Then we have Encore, which is more about societal issues. Then they have Dialogue. Then they have Special Report, which might not be published every Sunday, but at times they do when there is something special that they want to talk about. And then there is a literature one, Footloose, Instep, and Sheher, and a lot of other ones. So let me just open. So this is political economy. In which they are talking about the situation in Karachi and how the local government system can improve the city. This is in STEP. This basically focuses on the entertainment industry. So since this is the magazine edition for 6th of September, so they have perhaps talked about the dramas which are about our army and security forces. This is EDCO, in which they are talking about perhaps India and China controversy or something like this. Yeah, the latest, military movement in Ladakh and all of that. So in this one, they give more analytical story. Now, this is the special report which they have published because of the Karachi rain. So they are talking about Karachi rains in the special report, and there would be 4 or 5 pages, and all of them would contain stories only about this issue and the repercussions of Karachi rains. Then we have Dawn. Again, every Sunday, Dawn have this icon named magazine edition, which covers the local and international entertainment industry. And then they also have EOS, which basically is like a magazine for the society, and they would talk about a lot of societal issues and certain political issues in EOS. And here again, they are talking about the Karachi rains. Then we also have certain international magazines which are quite famous. I talked about Net Geo. Of course, since these are not electronically available unless you purchase them, but you can find some older versions, some older PDFs of National Geographic. But as far as you want to read the content of these kinds of magazines, so you can always go to their website, and they would make sure that at least थोड़ा बहुत content जो है वो publicly भी available होता है. Apart from that, if you can see these, we have Time, uh, perhaps the biggest one out there in the world right now. And then we have Newsweek. So all these are different kinds of magazines that you can find nationally and internationally as well. With that, we have almost come to the end of this video, because I just want to give you a brief recap of whatever we have covered in this entire module. So let me share my screen again and take you through the recap of module number 2. In module number 2, print media, we discussed newspapers. Uh, in newspapers, we discussed different pages and sections of the newspaper, the front page, the back page, national pages, city pages, economy, and all other pages like that. Then we discussed different layout and terminologies, like we discussed masthead, columns, we discussed what the lead story is, which is the most important story of the day, what are the teasers, they are the stories that you can find on the internal pages. We discussed sidebars, headline, byline, jump line, caption, folio, and a lot of other terminologies under the topic layout and terminologies. Then we discussed editorial pages, in which we discussed editorials and columns in detail. But I also told you about letters to the editor and, of course, cartoons. Then we discussed news values, 8 values that make any piece of information newsworthy. So we discussed timeliness, proximity, prominence, human interest, impact, trending, conflict, novelty, all these news values in one of the videos. And the final section was magazines, the one that we have discussed in this video. And in magazines, we have covered what really is a magazine, how it is different from that of a newspaper, what are the different types of magazine, and finally, what is kind of magazine, what is the kind of content that you will find in a specific magazine. So these were pretty much the topics that we discussed in this module, which was about print media. I know this might not be very easy for you, because print media, again, I think is something that you guys are not very well versed with, and these are a lot of topics. But since we have a quiz and it contains 30 marks, so you have to make sure that you cover all these things. Of course, we'll have the live session as well, and I will discuss the important topics in that also. But please make sure that you just go through everything, and side by side check the examples as well, if you can get hold of a newspaper or a magazine, and just check those things. If you have any questions, any queries for me, please don't forget to write to me on Moodle, on the Facebook group, or just email me. So all the best for the quiz, and I see you soon in the live session. Take care, everyone.